Cops laugh at black woman in court, then freeze when they find out who she really is. A charged silence settled over the courtroom as the defendant, a composed black woman, stepped forward. At the prosecution's table, two smug police officers exchanged knowing glances, convinced they were moments away from crushing her, publicly humiliating her for daring to challenge their authority. But what they didn't know would wipe the confidence from their faces. She was no ordinary defendant. The balance of power was about to shift in a way no one expected, swift, brutal, and unforgettable. Prejudice, buried secrets, and the weight of long overdue justice filled the air. What had begun as a simple case was about to explode into the most shocking trial the city had ever witnessed, a reckoning that had been years in the making. And no one in that courtroom would leave unchanged. That morning, a thick, rolling mist swept through Portfield's east side as if the city itself was holding its breath. Willow Glen was a quiet, respectable neighborhood, the kind with creaking porch swings, fresh mulch in flower beds, and retirees still reading the morning paper on their stoops. But beneath its orderly surface, something darker festered. And on that particular morning, it was finally rising to the surface. It started without warning. A black SUV pulled up to the curb beside a modest single-story home. A well-kept brick house with a faded lawn sign that read "Neighborhood Watch is watching you." The SUV door swung open, and out stepped a woman in dark slacks and a crisp, high-collared blouse the color of midnight. She was in her early 40s, her hair pulled into a coiled braid, her posture flawless. She moved with the precise confidence of someone used to commanding rooms where others whispered her name. Her name was Raven Sinclair, but no one in the neighborhood knew that. Not yet. As she approached the house, a commotion was already unfolding. 3 squad cars were parked at odd angles on the street, lights off, but presence unmistakably loud. Officers lingered in the front yard, some pretending to examine documents, others simply standing wide-legged, arms crossed, thumbs hooked onto utility belts. 2 of them, Officer Ryan Caldwell and Officer Ethan Brooks, were already infamous in Portfield's more vulnerable neighborhoods. Not for service, but for intimidation. Raven clocked them immediately, the predatory sharpness in Caldwell's eyes, the subtle twitch of adrenaline in Brooks' jaw. She had seen men like them before. She had dismantled men like them before. She said nothing at first, simply observing. Something was off. The police presence was excessive, the energy too performative for a routine investigation. The house they were surrounding belonged to Miss Rodriguez, a 74-year-old widow who had filed 2 civil complaints against Portfield PD in the past year. Raven had met with her last month, off the record. And now this? A random house check? Raven crossed the street, her voice calm but firm. "Officers, may I ask what's going on?" Caldwell turned, a smirk already forming on his lips. Brooks followed, scanning her face, then her clothes, calculating. "Ma'am," Caldwell said, his tone dripping with condescension. "This is an active investigation. You need to step back unless you want to get involved." Raven's expression remained neutral. She didn't move. "I have questions about the nature of this operation," she replied. "This resident has previously raised concerns about harassment. Who approved this warrant?" The smirk vanished from Caldwell's face. "Who are you again?" he asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. Raven parted her lips to answer, then stopped. "Not yet. Not here. Let them underestimate her. Let them show their hand first. I'm a concerned visitor," she said simply, "and I know the law well enough to see this is excessive." Brooks let out a low chuckle. "Concerned visitor? This your street?" "No." "Then walk, or I swear you'll be leaving in cuffs." She didn't flinch. That seemed to enrage them more. Across the street, a teenager had his phone out, recording. He had only just started filming when the situation escalated. Without warning, Caldwell lunged forward, grabbing Raven's arm and twisting it behind her back. Brooks moved in close, barking orders to no one in particular, as if the presence of an audience would justify what they were doing. "Obstructing a police operation," he snapped. "Refusing lawful orders. Get the cuffs." "She didn't do anything," someone yelled from a porch. She was just talking, but the officers didn't pause. The cuffs snapped shut behind Raven's back with a cold, mechanical finality. The metallic clink echoed too loudly in the quiet neighborhood. In that moment, something passed between Raven and the crowd gathering at the edges of their yards. She lifted her gaze, not with fear, not with anger, but with deliberate, icy calm. She scanned the street like a chess master reading the board mid-game. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes, dark and sharp like polished obsidian, were unshaken. She wasn't afraid. She was taking notes. And as Brooks shoved her toward the squad car, the teenager with the phone zoomed in. He captured a close-up of her face. A black woman in a navy blouse, hands bound, gaze steady. That image hit social media within minutes. At first, no one in Portfield recognized her name. Her appointment months ago hadn't made local headlines. Most people in the courtroom that would soon try her case had no idea who she was. Certainly not the two smug officers who thought they had just taught some arrogant troublemaker a lesson. But as the video spread, first through neighborhood group chats, then city forums, then national feeds, questions erupted like wildfire. Who was she? Why was she arrested? And why did she look like she knew exactly what was about to happen? The storm had landed. The city just didn't know it yet. The following Monday, the Portfield courthouse loomed over the city like a relic of some old, self-righteous empire. Columns too tall, flags too stiff in the wind. A security presence that felt more like a performance than protection. Inside, the lobby buzzed with anticipation. Journalists setting up tripods, lawyers adjusting their ties, citizens whispering behind folded newspapers. No one knew that by the end of the day, this case wouldn't just be Portfield's biggest scandal. It would be national news. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. No one could quite pinpoint why, but the state of Illinois versus Raven Sinclair felt different. The official charge was obstruction of a police investigation, the kind of offense that typically resulted in a quiet plea deal or a brief mention in the press. But something about this woman, her composure, her silence, her refusal to issue a single public statement, had cracked open the city's curiosity like a crowbar prying into rusted steel. Courtroom 3A filled to capacity within minutes. At the defense table sat Raven Sinclair, her hands folded neatly on the polished wood, dressed in a steel-gray suit that mirrored the brewing storm outside. She looked serene, untouched by the noise around her. But her eyes belonged to someone playing a long game, watchful, strategic, patient. Beside her sat Adrian Calloway, a defense attorney whose very presence signaled that this case would be anything but routine. A legend in civil rights law, Calloway had spent 3 decades waging legal war against corrupt municipalities and prosecutors. He didn't take cases for show. He took them to make someone bleed. Across the aisle, the prosecution exuded a different kind of energy. Clara Hastings, assistant district attorney and rising political star in Portfield, stood flanked by officers Ryan Caldwell and Ethan Brooks, the 2 men responsible for Raven's now infamous arrest. Clara was sharp, stylish, and politically ambitious. She had built her reputation on being tough but fair, and her ambition had teeth. Her posture was impeccable, her expression unreadable, but her eyes flicked toward Raven too often, as if trying to peel away the calm, to see what lay beneath. Caldwell and Brooks carried themselves like men who believed the system was their shield. Caldwell, broad-shouldered and self-assured, wore a tailored suit that made him look every inch the confident, seasoned officer. Brooks, on the other hand, sat tense. His knee bounced beneath the table, a subtle but telling sign that the adrenaline from Raven's arrest hadn't fully worn off. They exchanged low, smug remarks, chuckling under their breath like schoolyard bullies who thought they had already won. Then the bailiff called the courtroom to order. Judge Helen Carter entered, her robes sweeping behind her like shadows on marble. Known for her stern demeanor and absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics, she surveyed the room like a hawk. Her gavel struck the block with a sharp crack. "Let's proceed." Opening statements. Clara Hastings rose first, pacing before the jury. 12 Portfield residents, most of them still blinking away the morning fog. Her tone was crisp and confident. She painted Raven as a reckless disruptor, a woman who interfered with an active police investigation, endangered officers, and undermined the course of justice. Her voice was carefully measured, professional, authoritative, but beneath the surface lurked a faint curl of condescension every time she uttered the words, Miss Sinclair, as though Raven were an unruly child in need of correction. Caldwell and Brooks nodded solemnly at her words, trying their best to appear like dutiful civil servants who had simply followed protocol. But the atmosphere shifted the moment Adrian Calloway rose from his chair. Unlike Clara, he didn't pace. He didn't perform. Instead, he approached the jury slowly, his voice low and steady. Not like a lawyer arguing a case, but like a father delivering a hard truth to his children. "What you're going to hear over the next few days will disturb you," he said, his words carrying a quiet, unshakable weight. "Not because Miss Sinclair is guilty, but because the officers sitting across from us acted as though they would never be held accountable." He let the statement hang. His gaze flicked toward Caldwell and Brooks. Brooks shifted in his seat. Caldwell forced a smirk, a thin, brittle thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. Calloway continued, hinting at manipulated reports, missing footage, and a troubling history of misconduct buried under stacks of redacted files. He didn't reveal too much, not yet, but his closing remark landed like thunder. "And when you learn who Miss Sinclair really is, you'll understand why they were so desperate to silence her." The room inhaled as one. Judge Carter called for a recess. As people filed out into the hallway, the murmurs began to spread. Who is she? What are they hiding? And sitting at the defense table, Raven Sinclair simply smiled. Just slightly, as if the match she had struck had finally caught flame. The second act begins. By the time the jury reconvened after recess, the gallery was twice as packed and 10 times more restless. Word was rippling beyond the courtroom walls. Something about this woman, this Raven Sinclair, wasn't adding up. Not in the way the prosecution was telling it. She didn't flinch when accused. She didn't plead for mercy. She didn't look like someone running from accountability. She looked like someone marching toward it. And with every second that passed, more and more eyes were turning to her, not as the defendant, but as the mystery at the center of a very public reckoning. Then Adrian Calloway stood. "Your Honor." The defense calls Nina Delgado to the stand. Heads turned as a woman in her late 60s rose from her seat. Her frame was small, but her presence was striking. Nina's gray curls were pulled back, and she wore a maroon blazer pinned with a neighborhood watch badge. Her gait was slow but dignified. She was no stranger to this courtroom. Years ago, she had testified in a zoning case, preventing a corrupt housing development from bulldozing her neighborhood. People respected her. Some even feared her. And as she took the oath, her eyes never left the officers sitting at the prosecution's table. Adrian Calloway approached, his voice measured. "Ms. Delgado, were you present on the day Raven Sinclair was arrested?" "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. "I was walking my dog, Milo. We take the same route every morning." "And what did you see?" Nina's eyes narrowed slightly, as though sharpening the memory in her mind. "I saw 3 squad cars. Too much noise for a street where nothing ever happens." She exhaled. "And I saw officers moving like they were putting on a show for someone." Then Miss Sinclair approached them, calm, respectful, simply asking what was going on. She didn't raise her voice. She wasn't aggressive. She was firm but never hostile. Adrian nodded, then turned to the jury. "And what happened next?" Nina's expression darkened. One of the officers, the younger one, Brooks, I think, started barking orders. The older one, Caldwell, muttered something under his breath. I won't repeat it, but it wasn't professional. Then suddenly they grabbed her. No warning, no reason. It was like they wanted to make an example of her. A hush fell over the courtroom. Clara Hastings rose for cross-examination, her heels clicking against the floor in precise, measured beats. "Ms. Delgado, you said you were across the street. Exactly how far?" 30 feet, maybe 40, Nina replied coolly. "So you wouldn't have heard every word exchanged between Miss Sinclair and the officers, correct?" Nina tilted her head slightly. I heard enough, and I saw everything. Clara pressed on. Forgive me, but at that distance, do you wear glasses for reading? Nina's expression sharpened. Not for seeing police mistreat someone in broad daylight. A ripple of quiet laughter flickered through the gallery. Clara's lips tightened. Have you been involved in local activism, Ms. Delgado? Her tone had shifted, laced now with strategic skepticism. Nina didn't hesitate. I've stood up when something smells wrong. If that's activism, then yes. She turned to the jury. And this reeks. Clara exhaled through her nose, returning to her seat without another question. She knew better than to engage in a battle of words with a witness who had just won the room with a single phrase. As Nina stepped down, Adrian stood again. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to present surveillance footage from a home camera down the street. Judge Carter gave a brief nod. The lights dimmed. Above the jury, grainy black and white footage flickered onto the screen. There was Raven Sinclair, standing across the street, arms at her sides, body language calm and composed. Then, without warning, Brooks stepped forward, hand on his cuffs. Caldwell flanked her. She took a step back, palms held out in a gesture of restraint, not aggression. Then suddenly they grabbed her, slammed her against the car. No sound, just pure motion. When the footage froze on Raven's restrained form, the gallery sat in stunned silence. Adrian turned back to the jury. This, he said, his voice steady, is what the officers called obstruction. His gaze passed over them slowly.
No yelling, no pushing.
No crime, just questions, met with violence. Across the room, Caldwell shifted in his seat. Brooks looked pale. Judge Carter leaned forward, her usually impassive face tighter now, more thoughtful. The mask was slipping, not just from the officer's narrative, but from the entire system's face. A woman had been arrested for daring to ask why. And now, the jury was seeing exactly what that defiance had cost her. Raven remained silent, but as the lights came back on and the prosecution scrambled to regroup, her silence spoke volumes. She was still waiting, still watching, and they had no idea the storm she was about to unleash. Beyond the courtroom, the storm brewing inside didn't stay confined to the courtroom walls. It began seeping into City Hall, the streets. After the footage and Nina Delgado's damning testimony, murmurs of doubt grew louder, in Portfield's public forums, in local newsrooms, in the editorial pages of the city's papers. Social media exploded with speculation and outrage. Who was Raven Sinclair? Why had officers Caldwell and Brooks reacted so violently? And why did their story seem thinner with every new witness? The city teetered on the edge of a reckoning. And inside the courtroom, the case was shifting. This was no longer just a defense strategy, this was a psychological war. A battle not just of facts, but of perception, of memory, of motive. Adrian Calloway felt it. He sat at the defense table, flipping through his notes while the jury filed back into their seats. Their expressions were sharper now, less neutral. They were watching everyone. Even Judge Helen Carter, so meticulously restrained in her demeanor, leaned forward more often now. Her eyes flicked toward the prosecution with subtle scrutiny. Adrian rose. The defense calls Dr. Alana Pierce to the stand. All eyes turned. A poised black woman in her early 50s walked confidently to the witness box. Dr. Pierce was a forensic psychologist, renowned for her work in racial trauma and police-civilian dynamics. Her presence signaled something unmistakable. This trial was entering a new phase. A phase that wouldn't just examine the incident itself, but the mindset behind it. Adrian folded his hands on the podium. Dr. Pierce, can you help the jury understand how repeated exposure to law enforcement harassment affects the psychology of those targeted? She nodded, her voice clear and steady. Certainly. In my 2 decades of research, I've observed that individuals, particularly those from historically marginalized communities, develop a form of hypervigilance. It's a survival mechanism. When someone like Miss Sinclair sees a cluster of officers surrounding a home in her neighborhood, especially when she knows the resident is elderly and vulnerable, her instinct isn't confrontation, it's concern. A murmur passed through the gallery. Adrian let it settle. Then softly, "And in your expert opinion, did the footage we reviewed earlier suggest any behavior from Ms. Sinclair that could be interpreted as hostile?" Dr. Pierce shook her head, her response firm.
No.
She displayed classic signs of regulation. Open palms, calm gestures, a lowered voice. She was trying to de-escalate. Adrian nodded. And how would an officer, one already conditioned to view certain bodies as threatening, interpret those gestures? Dr. Pierce exhaled slightly, then answered, "If that officer carries implicit or explicit bias, they might interpret even peaceful behavior as defiance, especially if the civilian is black and questioning authority." Clara Hastings shot to her feet. "Objection!" But it was too late. The words had landed. During cross-examination, Clara attempted to poke holes. "Dr. Pierce, you weren't there. You didn't hear the tone of voice. Isn't it possible that Miss Sinclair's body language shifted before or after the footage?" Dr. Pierce remained steady. "The footage is clear. The officers escalated. Not Miss Sinclair." Clara's jaw tightened as she returned to her seat, her arguments beginning to fray. The next move came swiftly. Adrian called for Officer Ryan Caldwell to take the stand. The defense had secured his testimony under subpoena. The courtroom held its collective breath as the veteran officer approached. His usual confidence was still there, but now it wavered. Cracks in the story. Under direct examination from Clara, Caldwell reiterated his version of events. Miss Sinclair was obstructive, aggressive, and threatened to make a call that would bring hell down on us. He spoke with rehearsed authority, but his eyes darted too much, searching the jury, the judge, and finally, resting uneasily on Raven. Then Adrian stepped forward. "Officer Caldwell," he began, his tone measured but laced with steel. "You claim Miss Sinclair made threats. Are those threats recorded on your body cam?" A pause. "There was an issue with the cam that day," Caldwell muttered. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "A malfunction?" Caldwell nodded. "Yes. And Officer Brooks' cam? Same issue." Adrian let the silence stretch. "So you're asking this jury to believe that both your body cams failed at the exact moment Miss Sinclair allegedly threatened you?" Caldwell bristled. "It's happened before. These things aren't perfect." Adrian walked to the evidence monitor. "Let's consult department maintenance logs." He tapped the screen. According to these, both devices were tested and approved less than 24 hours before the arrest. No reports of malfunction. Silence. Adrian stepped closer. "Officer Caldwell, isn't it true that this isn't the first time your body cam has failed during a civilian complaint?" "Objection." "Overruled." Caldwell shifted in his seat. "I don't recall." Adrian held up a document. "Then perhaps this will refresh your memory. A copy of an internal affairs complaint. One from a black teenager detained last year under suspicious circumstances. The footage? Lost." The courtroom was ice cold now. Every juror leaning in. Caldwell's facade was cracking, sweat gathering at his brow. He stole a glance at Brooks, whose face had gone ghostly and still. And through it all, Raven Sinclair had not said a word. She sat quietly, her eyes steady, watching the prosecution's mask slide, inch by inch off its face. The chessboard was set, and the next move would be devastating. The trial becomes a reckoning. By the time the 5th day of testimony dawned, the courthouse had become a pressure cooker of whispers, headlines, and building outrage. What had begun as a small-town trial for a minor obstruction charge had now pulsed into the veins of national discourse. Satellite trucks lined the curb outside the Portfield courthouse. Their long antennas pointed skyward, like metallic trees searching for a signal from the gods. Inside, the energy had shifted. No longer just a detached legal proceeding. This had become something else, something bigger. People were no longer watching to see if Raven Sinclair was innocent. They were watching to see how deep the rot went. The unexpected witnesses. When Adrian Calloway entered the courtroom that morning, he was flanked by Raven and her assistant, Maya, both solemn but composed. Raven wore a deep forest green suit, understated yet sharp. Her eyes were focused, unreadable. She had not spoken publicly, not given a single interview or statement. And yet, her silence had only deepened the intrigue. Online, people had begun calling her the woman they underestimated. And now they were waiting to see how long that underestimation would last. Today's strategy was about leverage. Adrian knew the officer's stories were unraveling. Now it was time to apply pressure in a new way, by shaking the prosecution's foundation, with the unexpected appearance of allies no one saw coming. As the crowd settled and the judge banged her gavel, Adrian stood. The defense calls Reverend Elijah Hawthorne to the stand. A hush fell over the gallery. The tall, silver-haired minister stepped forward. He was no ordinary preacher. He was a civil rights icon in the region. His presence at community protests, city hall hearings, his fight for justice, stretched back over 3 decades. And when he took the oath, the weight of history seemed to echo in his voice. The testimony that changed everything. Adrian folded his hands. Reverend Hawthorne, can you describe your connection to the events leading to Miss Sinclair's arrest? The Reverend's voice was steady. I wasn't there that day, he admitted. But I've known Raven Sinclair long before Portfield ever did. And I know the pattern that runs through this courtroom. He paused. Different uniforms. Same sickness. The air in the courtroom tightened. Then he began. He spoke of countless complaints made against officers Caldwell and Brooks. Complaints from young men, single mothers, elderly residents. People without power. People who had been ignored. What happened to Miss Sinclair is not new, he said. The only thing new is that someone finally has the standing to make it undeniable. The words hung in the air. Then Adrian gave Maya a nod. She turned toward the back of the gallery and opened the doors. Vanessa Holloway walked in, and the room gasped, a shift no one saw coming. Once, Vanessa Holloway had been one of Portfield's most vocal conservative columnists, a staunch law and order advocate. She had defended the Portfield Police Department without hesitation, until last year, until her teenage son was stopped and frisked without cause. And when she filed a complaint, she got nothing. Silence. For months, she had stayed quiet. Until now, under oath, Vanessa Holloway turned to the jury, and she began to speak. I spent years believing the system worked, Vanessa Holloway said, her voice steady. Because it worked for me until it didn't. And when I saw Miss Sinclair arrested, I saw my son. I saw every mother who never got an apology. The gallery was frozen. Even Judge Helena Carter seemed shaken. Clara Hastings looked rattled, flipping through her notes as if a strategy might suddenly materialize behind them. Officers Caldwell and Brooks sat stiffly, their earlier swagger now fossilized into something brittle and afraid. But Adrian wasn't finished. He called Sergeant Javier Dominguez to the stand, a 20-year veteran of the Portfield PD, known for being quiet, reliable, and, until now, completely silent about his department's inner workings. Dominguez, subpoenaed to testify, looked nervous but determined. He spoke carefully. He had arrived at the scene minutes after Raven's arrest. She was already in cuffs, shaken but composed. More damningly, he confirmed that both Caldwell and Brooks' body cams had been inexplicably powered off, a direct violation of department protocol. Then came the crack in the wall. I filed 2 internal reports against Officer Caldwell in the past 5 years, Dominguez said, his voice low but clear. Both were quietly dismissed. The gallery erupted. Judge Carter called for order, banging her gavel repeatedly. But the damage was done. At the prosecution's table, Clara's face had gone pale. She tried to regain control with a tense cross-examination, accusing Dominguez of holding a personal grudge. But his answers were calm, unwavering. This isn't about a grudge, he said. It's about the truth. As Dominguez stepped down, Adrian turned briefly toward Raven. She met his gaze and gave a single, slow nod. The tide had turned. The court no longer saw Raven as a defendant. It saw her as a fault line, one that had cracked wide open. The illusion of law without prejudice had shattered. and now no one knew how far the quake would reach. The tension inside the courtroom had become something alive, something tangible, thick, heavy, like the air before a summer storm. Every glance, every shuffle of paper, every subtle breath from the jury carried weight. People weren't just here for the trial anymore. They were here for the unraveling. The once confident facade of officers Ryan Caldwell and Ethan Brooks had begun to fracture, hairline cracks widening with each passing day. The gallery, once polite and reserved, now held a mix of hushed defiance and cautious hope. Every morning, the line outside the courthouse grew longer. The people of Portfield weren't just watching this case anymore. They were waiting for justice to wake up. That morning, when Adrian Calloway stepped into the courtroom, he carried the expression of a man holding a blade behind his back. He had seen how the system protected itself, how misplaced files and conveniently missing footage had a habit of smothering truth before it could speak. But not this time. Not with Raven Sinclair sitting beside him, composed, watchful, a living reminder that power could be both graceful and furious at once. Her silence up until now hadn't been weakness. It had been calculation. She had been waiting for the moment when her truth would strike like thunder. The gallery stirred when the first unexpected figure entered. Reverend Elijah Hawthorne, tall and solemn in a dark overcoat, his presence as commanding as any official in the room. A lifelong civil rights advocate, a spiritual cornerstone of Portfield's Black community. His arrival sent a message louder than any protest chant. The people were watching, and the people remembered. Following him was Vanessa Holloway, a former conservative commentator. Once, her scathing editorials had praised the Portfield PD as pillars of order. But all of that changed the day her teenage son was wrongfully stopped and searched by Officer Caldwell. That day had shattered her beliefs, and now she too was here. Her presence carried the weight of both penance and conviction. As the judge gavelled in the session, Adrian rose. "Your Honor, the defense calls Reverend Elijah Hawthorne to the stand." Whispers rippled through the gallery. The Reverend stepped forward, raising his right hand with the gravitas of a man preparing to testify not just for the court, but for history. His voice was calm, powerful, each word landing with precision. "I've been in Portfield for 40 years, he said. "I've buried sons who shouldn't have died. I've sat with mothers who asked why the badge never apologized. Today, I sit here because this city has a chance to do more than mourn. It has a chance to correct." He spoke of Raven Sinclair not just as a defendant but as a woman of principle. Someone he had crossed paths with years before when she was quietly investigating discriminatory policing policies across the state. He described a pattern of abuse, a pattern tied to certain officers like Caldwell and Brooks, men whose behavior had been tolerated for far too long, men whose uniforms were used not to protect, but to intimidate. Then Vanessa Holloway took the stand. Her testimony was quieter, more personal. She spoke of the fear in her son's eyes, the indignity of knowing her wealth and status couldn't shield her family from prejudice. "I used to write about law and order like it was sacred," she said, her voice trembling. "But order without justice is just control." The courtroom was silent. At the prosecution's table, Clara Hastings shifted in her seat. Her once unshakable confidence had dulled into caution. She tried to object, to pivot, to distract, but each objection landed with less conviction than the last. Every effort to redirect the narrative now felt more like desperation. And then Adrian dropped the hammer. "The defense calls Sergeant Javier Dominguez." Collective gasp. Dominguez had served on the force for over 2 decades. Respected, quiet, not known for choosing sides. But now here he was, summoned under subpoena, his expression haunted, reluctant, and under Adrian's questioning, he admitted what few officers ever did, that he had witnessed questionable behavior by Caldwell and Brooks firsthand, that he had filed internal reports that, just like the body cam footage, had somehow conveniently disappeared. He had filed reports that mysteriously vanished. And now he admitted something even heavier, that he had grown afraid. Not of criminals, but of his own department. Silence. I saw Miss Sinclair in cuffs that day, Dominguez said, his voice steady but weighted with something unshakable. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't threatening. She was asking questions. That's not a crime. When Clara cross-examined him, she tried to paint him as a man with a grudge, someone using this trial to settle personal scores. But he didn't waver. The truth doesn't need a grudge, he replied. It just needs to be told. As he stepped down, the courtroom remained in stunned silence. The foundation beneath the prosecution's case had been rattled yet again. And Raven, she didn't speak, didn't move, but something had shifted in her gaze. Something colder, sharper. The storm was no longer on its way. It had arrived. And the question now wasn't whether the courtroom could withstand it. It was whether Portfield itself could. The courtroom was packed wall to wall, the air humming with electricity. Rumors had been swirling since the previous afternoon. Something big was coming. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised, cameras clicking in rhythmic intervals. Jurors sat stiff-backed, wide-eyed, their expressions betraying a mixture of anticipation and unease. Even Judge Helena Carter seemed unusually alert, her fingers twitching slightly at the edge of her bench. Outside, the line of people hoping to enter the courthouse wrapped around the block, and at the heart of it all sat Raven Sinclair, silent, composed, perfectly still, like the eye of the storm she had summoned. Adrian Calloway stood beside her, his voice calm but charged with restrained power. Your Honor, the defense would now like to call Miss Raven Sinclair to the stand. A ripple passed through the room, subtle but unmistakable. The jury turned to watch her rise. She moved slowly, deliberately, the heels of her shoes striking the floor in sharp, deliberate echoes as she stepped toward the witness chair. Maya, seated in the gallery, glanced up from her notes. A flicker of nervous pride crossed her face. This was the moment they had been building toward, not just a defense, but a revelation. Raven took the oath with quiet confidence, raising her right hand, her voice firm and unwavering. Once seated, Adrian approached her with the reverence of a man standing on the edge of history. Miss Sinclair, he began, please tell the court about your background. Her gaze swept the courtroom, not defiantly, but with purpose. I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, she said, her voice smooth and measured. My father was a Baptist minister. My mother, a public school principal. I learned early what it meant to live under the weight of both expectation and injustice. She went on to explain her education, degrees in political science and criminal justice, her time with the FBI, years spent specializing in civil rights investigations and counterterrorism. With each detail, the perception of her shifted. No longer just a woman in handcuffs on a sidewalk. She was something far more formidable. The courtroom listened in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the image of an unruly civilian with the credentials now being laid bare with chilling clarity. Adrian took a slow breath before delivering the final question. And what is your current role, Miss Sinclair? She didn't hesitate. I am the director of the National Civil Security Bureau under the Department of Homeland Security. I was appointed 4 months ago by presidential order. The silence shattered. The gallery erupted into gasps. Reporters scribbled furiously, fingers flying over keyboards. Even a few jurors' mouths fell open. Judge Carter slammed her gavel. Once, twice. Order. Order in the court. But order had already been broken. At the prosecution's table, Clara Hastings sat frozen, mid-note, her face a mask of disbelief. Caldwell visibly paled, his eyes darting around the room like a man seeking an exit. Brooks sank into his chair, his expression that of someone watching the tide rise too fast around his neck. Adrian let the chaos settle before turning back to Raven. And on the day of your arrest, what was your reason for being on Alder Street? Raven's answer came without hesitation. I was conducting an unannounced, independent audit of civil rights compliance in local police activity, she said. The house under surveillance belonged to a woman I had met during prior outreach. I approached the officers out of concern for excessive force. I never raised my voice. I never interfered with their operation. I only asked questions. "And were you arrested without cause?" "Yes," she said flatly, "because they saw a black woman asking questions. That was all the cause they needed." The courtroom fell into a breathless silence, not out of disbelief, but out of recognition. What had once seemed like an ambiguous case now stood fully exposed. Raven hadn't just been wrongly arrested. She had been silenced. Silenced by a system that had never thought to ask who she truly was. Her final words before stepping down landed with poetic finality. "I didn't come here to pull rank. I came here to remind you that power without accountability is just oppression dressed in uniform." And with that, she returned to her seat while the courtroom reeled from the weight of truth dropped like a hammer in its midst. The tide had not only turned, it had thundered ashore. The revelation of Raven Sinclair's identity had detonated through the courtroom like a slow-moving explosion, every word of her testimony still echoing in the stunned silence that followed. But while the jury and the public processed the shock, Adrian Calloway was already moving into the final, most dangerous phase of his strategy. Total exposure. Now that Raven's truth had shattered the prosecution's illusion, it was time to finish peeling back the layers of deception surrounding the Westbridge Police Department and its chosen defenders. The day's proceedings didn't begin with a whisper. They began with a collision between the story the officers had so carefully constructed and the damning facts waiting to tear it apart. Adrian stepped before the jury, his voice sharpened with finality. "Your Honor, the defense requests permission to call a rebuttal witness, Officer Devin Marks." A stir rippled through the gallery. No one recognized the name, no one except Clara Hastings. She looked up sharply, her spine straightening in instant recognition. She knew what was coming. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and a young officer in uniform stepped inside. Nervous, pale, Officer Marks was slight, with anxious eyes and the rigid posture of someone who had spent days deciding whether to speak or disappear. He approached the witness stand with the caution of a soldier crossing a minefield, casting a fleeting glance toward the prosecution's table before quickly looking away. Once sworn in, Adrian approached, his tone careful but deliberate. "Officer Marks, you work in the Westbridge PD Digital Evidence Unit, correct?" "Yes," Marks answered, his voice thin but steady. "I handle the technical review and storage of body cam and surveillance footage." "And were you on duty the day of Miss Sinclair's arrest?" "I was." Adrian's next question came like a blade slicing through pretense. "Did you receive any requests regarding the body cam footage from that day?" A pause, a swallow, then, "Yes, I was asked to alter the logs." The room inhaled as one. Adrian stepped closer. "What do you mean by alter?" Marks hesitated, his face paling. "Lieutenant Avery instructed me to backdate a malfunction report for both Officer Caldwell's and Officer Brooks's body cams. He said it was just a paperwork fix. But it wasn't." His voice wavered slightly. "The footage was there at first. And what happened to it? I was told to delete it, not just move it. Erase it completely." Marks exhaled shakily. He said the case was minor, that the optics were bad. Adrian's voice remained steady. "Did Officers Caldwell and Brooks know about this?" Marks looked down. "Yes, they were CC'd in the request." His fingers clenched against the witness stand. "And Officer Brooks followed up with me personally. Told me to clean the mess so it wouldn't come back on them." The gallery exploded into hushed whispers. Judge Carter hammered her gavel again and again. But the room had already ignited. Clara Hastings looked like a woman cornered. She shot to her feet, demanding that Officer Marks be held in contempt for violating departmental confidentiality. Adrian countered instantly. "The people have a right to know when justice is being manipulated from the inside." Judge Carter ruled in his favor. The testimony would stand. The tide had become irreversible. Then came the final blow. Adrian displayed a newly admitted exhibit, a chain of internal emails, recovered through Raven's federal clearance. The messages exposed a months-long pattern. Caldwell and Brooks routinely deleting footage or filing malfunctions. Nearly every instance followed an incident involving minority civilians. Dozens of them. And in almost every case, Internal Affairs had deemed the complaints inconclusive due to lack of available evidence. There was no recovering from it. The prosecution sat frozen. Clara stared blankly at the screen as her star witnesses unraveled before her eyes. Brooks looked ashen, his foot tapping beneath the table like a man ready to flee. Caldwell clenched his jaw so tightly the muscles twitched. The courtroom had become a crucible. Every illusion of integrity surrounding these officers had melted away, leaving only the raw, uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just about Raven anymore. This was about everyone they had silenced, every neighborhood they had terrorized, every complaint that had vanished without a trace. And at the center of it all, Raven sat still, silent, once again watching as the scales tipped. But this time, it wasn't just her life hanging in the balance. It was the entire system, and the whole world was finally watching. By the 9th day, the courtroom no longer felt like a hall of law, felt like a battlefield of truth. The grandeur of the judge's bench, the polished marble floors, the murmur of spectators. It all seemed fragile, barely able to contain the seismic tension crackling beneath the surface. The once confident prosecution was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Clara Hastings, once poised and calculating, now looked like a gambler watching her last chip slide across the table. Officers Ryan Caldwell and Ethan Brooks sat like hollowed-out versions of themselves. Their postures were stiff, their expressions cracked with anxiety. They had arrived in this courtroom armored in uniforms, carrying the confidence of men who believed they were untouchable. That armor was now shattered, replaced with sweat-slicked brows, darting eyes, and a silence that spoke louder than any past bravado. And Raven Sinclair? She remained still, calm, almost unnervingly so. She sat with her hands folded, not as a victim seeking redemption, but as a sentinel watching the fire she had ignited spread to every corner of the courtroom. Her truth had been laid bare, her credentials had been confirmed, and the false narrative Caldwell and Brooks had so confidently spun was now nothing but ash beneath the relentless weight of testimony, footage, and damning internal records. But Raven knew the collapse wasn't complete. Not yet. Adrian Calloway stood with a quiet authority that had only grown more commanding with each passing day. "Your Honor," he said, addressing Judge Helena Carter, "the defense would like to recall Officer Ethan Brooks to the stand for additional testimony." Brooks's head snapped toward his attorney, whose whispered objections landed flat against the inevitability of the moment. Reluctantly, Brooks stood. His hands twitched as he made his way back to the witness stand. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by tight lips, reddened cheeks, and the posture of a man backed into a corner. Adrian approached, slow and deliberate, almost gentle. "Officer Brooks, you testified last week that Miss Sinclair verbally threatened you and Officer Caldwell, that she attempted to interfere with an active police investigation. Correct?" "Yes," Brooks mumbled, barely above a whisper. Adrian nodded. "We've since heard testimony from 3 eyewitnesses, 2 digital forensic experts, a psychologist, and Sergeant Javier Dominguez, all of whom dispute your account." He took a step closer. "We've seen video footage contradicting your timeline. We've reviewed internal complaints that place your credibility into serious question." A pause. "So let me ask again, under oath." Adrian's voice remained even, but the weight of the moment pressed down like a final verdict. "Did Miss Sinclair threaten you?" A beat. Brooks stared at the floor. The silence stretched long enough for the entire gallery to begin leaning forward, waiting. "No," Brooks finally muttered. "Not exactly." Adrian's gaze remained steady. "What did she say?" Brooks swallowed. "She asked questions," he admitted, "about the warrant, about our procedures." "And was that a threat, Officer Brooks?" A pause. Then, quietly, "No." Adrian nodded slowly. "Thank you." He let the silence stretch just long enough before adding, "One more question. Why did you follow up with Officer Marks about the footage?" Brooks shifted uncomfortably. I didn't want things to get out of hand. She was a federal officer, and I panicked. So you knew who she was? Not at first, Brooks said quickly. But when I found out later, I was scared. Scared of what? Adrian asked, voice even. Accountability. Brooks didn't answer. The courtroom stirred, the murmurs louder this time. Adrian turned toward Judge Carter. The defense rests its case. It was like the last domino falling in a chain reaction. Clara Hastings stood, but only to announce that she had no further witnesses. Her voice was thin, dry. She didn't attempt a passionate closing argument, only a procedural one, delivered like a formality she no longer believed in. The illusion of certainty she had maintained throughout the trial had crumbled. She looked defeated, and perhaps somewhere deep down, ashamed. That night, news outlets aired footage from the courtroom, splicing Brooks's reluctant confession with Raven's testimony and expert analysis. Clips went viral. People called Raven the woman who unmasked the lie, the silence breaker, the reckoning in a navy suit. Hashtags lit up. Hashtag justice for Raven. Hashtag Portfield reckoning. Hashtag truth in uniform. The next day, inside the courtroom, Officer Caldwell requested to address the court. His voice shook as he offered a public apology. Stammered, incomplete, but real. Brooks followed, his face pale, admitting they had let fear and bias dictate their actions. Raven listened quietly. She didn't gloat. She didn't even flinch. When asked if she had anything to say in response, she stood and simply said, "Acknowledgement is not absolution, but it is a start." And just like that, the last breath of their lie was exhaled. The mask had fallen, and the city of Portfield was now staring at the truth it could no longer ignore. The verdict. The 10th day arrived with an eerie stillness, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was taut, electric, the kind of tension that clings to skin and makes the air feel heavier than it should. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, their equipment humming with anticipation. Protesters and Raven supporters crowded the courthouse steps, holding signs, hands clasped, eyes lifted toward the windows as if they might glimpse history unfolding inside. The jury had deliberated for less than a day, but the truth had long since spoken. All that remained was for the law to acknowledge it. Raven sat motionless at the defense table, flanked by Adrian Calloway and Maya, her ever-steady assistant. Her hands were folded, her gaze fixed ahead, her expression unreadable. The calm she projected wasn't complacency, it was resolve. She had faced the weight of the system and refused to bend. She had exposed the machinery behind the badges, laid bare the rot festering beneath sealed records and official reports. And now, even she could feel the tremor in the air, like something ancient and deeply rooted was about to be judged. The courtroom doors opened. "All rise," the bailiff called. The jury filed in, every face solemn, unreadable. Not a whisper stirred. Judge Helena Carter's voice was steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her tightly wound hair and the unshakable posture of someone who had borne witness to history, rose. She held a folded slip of paper. She handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. A beat of silence. Then, Judge Carter's voice rang out across the courtroom. "On the charge of false arrest, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of filing falsified police reports, guilty." The air erupted. Gasps, shouts, tears, applause, stifled only by the sharp bang of Judge Carter's gavel. But no amount of wood-striking wood could erase the sound of vindication echoing through that chamber. Caldwell sat motionless, head bowed, fists clenched against the arms of his chair. Beside him, Brooks looked hollow, as if every last ounce of bravado had drained away, leaving behind only the crushing weight of reckoning. Clara Hastings closed her eyes and exhaled, slowly, as though releasing the last breath of a truth she had fought not to see. For her, this trial had begun as a career move, a quick conviction wrapped in the optics of order. Now, she looked like a woman who had stood too close to the fire and realized too late that it was justice burning through the lies. Judge Carter's voice, steady but not without feeling, continued. Given the gravity of the charges and the compelling evidence of systemic misconduct, sentencing will be scheduled for next month. In the meantime, Officers Caldwell and Brooks are remanded to federal custody under electronic monitoring. Their employment with the Portfield Police Department is terminated, effective immediately. The officers were led away, not with defiance, but with the quiet submission of men who knew the end had come. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Camera flashes exploded in bursts of white light. But Raven didn't flinch. She rose slowly, not to face the cameras, but to face the people. The faces in the gallery. The faces that had watched, waited, wept. She walked toward Reverend Elijah Hawthorne, who stood to greet her with quiet reverence. Vanessa Holloway offered a soft smile, her eyes glistening, her pen finally still. Maya stood beside Raven, pride radiating from her like a pulse. A reporter managed to push forward, microphone in hand. "Ms. Sinclair, do you have anything to say to the public?" Raven paused, looked straight into the lens. Accountability is not vengeance. It is the beginning of healing. She let the words settle. Today wasn't just a verdict for me. It was a mirror held up to a system that has too often refused to see itself. Her voice was clear, strong. If you're watching this and wondering what comes next, it's up to all of us. And with that, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, not as the accused, but as a catalyst, as a woman who had once been silenced and refused to stay that way. While the storm gathered and the thunder roared, the gavel may have closed the trial, but Raven Sinclair had unleashed something far more potent. The first real crack in a wall that had, for far too long, seemed unbreakable. Now, with the nation watching, change wasn't just on its way, it had already started. Weeks passed, but the ripple effects of the trial were just beginning to be felt, and even then, the ground beneath Portfield still seemed unstable, like something fundamental had shifted. The city, once shielded by the illusion of order and justice, now stood exposed and raw under a spotlight it could no longer diminish. The Westbridge Police Department announced a full internal review, though many speculated it was more a survival strategy than an act of genuine repentance. Several senior officials quietly resigned or were reassigned. A federal oversight task force, co-chaired by none other than Raven Sinclair, began auditing departments across the state, targeting those with decades of suppressed complaints and fabricated evidence. What had begun as a personal fight had ignited a statewide, and potentially nationwide, reckoning. Raven never returned to obscurity, though she never sought the limelight either. When national media outlets requested interviews, she gave one, and only one. An unscripted sit-down where she spoke not about her own journey, but about the thousands who would never see their day in court. "Justice," she said, "is not a moment, it's a muscle. If we don't use it, it forgets how to work." The clip went viral, airing on every major network. Her words were transformed into quotes on murals and printed on t-shirts worn at rallies across the country. Maya remained by her side, now promoted to senior advisor for community engagement. Adrian Calloway received so many calls from potential clients and civil rights organizations that his modest office turned into a hub for whistleblowers and wronged citizens ready to speak out. Vanessa Holloway began a column titled "Bridging the Divide," dedicated to police accountability. Reverend Elijah Hawthorne led a city-funded initiative to train young leaders in public advocacy. But it was one quiet moment weeks later that would define everything. Raven returned to Alder Street, where it all began. The neighborhood had transformed. Flowers bloomed, sidewalks were swept clean, and children played freely. An elderly woman waved from her porch, her eyes filled with gratitude. On the side of a nearby community center, a mural stretched across the brick wall. Raven's silhouette stood tall among shattered badges, surrounded by words painted in bold strokes. Truth doesn't whisper forever. One day it roars. And that roar, Raven knew, had only just begun. In today's world, Raven Sinclair's story is more than just fiction. It's a mirror. Her fight against the abuse of power and systemic bias reflects the lived experiences of countless individuals who face discrimination, intimidation, or injustice simply for speaking out or asking questions. It serves as a reminder that even those who enforce the law are not above it, and that silence in the face of injustice only allows it to grow. The most powerful lesson we can take from Raven's journey is this: truth has power, but it requires courage to bring it to light. Whether we are community leaders, students, or everyday citizens, we all have a role to play in demanding accountability, protecting the vulnerable, and speaking up when we see something wrong. Because change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from standing up, just as Raven did, and refusing to be silenced when it matters most. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.